This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films. And I talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, just all those bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films also I have some investment or interest in. I don't see the point in me sitting here and punching down. I think it's a job and a half just to get a film off the ground and made. And this podcast really is a celebration of that, warts and all, dependent on just how the film turned out. As it happens, the two films I've picked for this particular episode, well, I'm a big fan of both of them. I think one of those is slightly more contentious than the other. So I'm going to start with perhaps the more divisive one. Let's go back to 1998 and let's start this episode with a sing-song.
Let me know you'll wait for me. Hold me like you'll never let me go. 'Cause I'm leaving on a jet plane. Don't know when I'll be back again.
Leaving on a jet plane. I don't know when I'll be back again.
Leaving on a jet plane. I don't know when I'll be back again.
So, Truman, this is who you found to save the planet.
Ross, you good to go? One sec.
Right, well, we've got much to get through here. That was a clip from 1998's Armageddon, directed by Michael Bay, written by, and it's an odd collection of credits, Jonathan Hensleigh and J.J. Abrams, with an adaptation, a rare adaptation credit given by the WGA, that's Writers Guild of America, to Tony Gilroy and Shane Salerno. Story by Robert Ray Poole and Jonathan Hensleigh. The cast for this one, led by Bruce Willis, Billy Bob Thornton, Ben Affleck, Liv Tyler, Will Patton, Steve Buscemi, William Fichtner, Owen Wilson, Michael Clarke Duncan, Peter Stormare, and a big hello to Jason Isaacs. So, the story of this one, well, it goes in tandem with the story of Deep Impact that I've covered on a previous podcast, that 1998 was going to be the summer of two competing asteroids are going to hit the planet Earth and wipe us all out, and who can possibly save us. In the case of Armageddon, well, this was a project, unlike Deep Impact, that came together really quite quickly. That Deep Impact had been in development in various degrees for a good decade or two before that happened. But then the genesis of Armageddon, well, there's two different stories to it. One of them, as reported by Variety, was that Robert Ray Poole came up with the original screenplay and Jonathan Hensleigh came in to do a rewrite. But on the pretty legendary DVD commentary for Armageddon, which was on a Criterion Edition DVD that was released in the US of the film, a different story. That after Bad Boys, Michael Bay's directorial debut, had become a big success, he agreed to a two-picture deal with Disney. The first of those two pictures was The Rock, which came out in 1996 and was going into a competitive marketplace. Hence, Bay signed up for two films because he figured if The Rock didn't work, at least he's got something to fall back on. As it turned out, The Rock did work, and then there was the small matter of, well, what film does he make? So Michael Bay started going through the collection of scripts that Disney had, and also the collection of scripts that producer Jerry Bruckheimer had, but really wasn't impressed. He wasn't finding anything he wanted to make. Now, what happened then, and this was told in Starlog magazine's October 1996 issue, Jonathan Hensleigh came up with the idea that Hensleigh rang up Michael Bay with a 3-sentence idea for the film. That idea was then taken by Jerry Bruckheimer and Michael Bay to Disney. Now, Disney in the 1990s was in a very different place. It started the 1990s by being the most frugal studio in town, that it wasn't paying big money after Dick Tracy had come out and not done big business. It wasn't looking to pay big money to movie stars. It was looking to make cheap, economical family films on the whole, and lots of them. Towards the end of the 90s, it realised it needed to embrace movie star culture a bit more. Joe Roth came in to head the studio up. He'd been heading up Fox at the start of the 90s, and he came with a big checkbook and was determined to do some bigger gambles and improve Disney's box office performance. So it was a good confluence of circumstance that led Bruckheimer and Bay to Joe Roth's door. Roth wanted a big film for the summer of 1998. Bay pitched for the film to be Disney's big movie of the summer of 1998 as well. Disney said yes. The deal was done. A script hadn't been written. So this was what? I mean, if we're looking at it, it's just under 2 years before the film would come out. Disney signed the deal that would make it the most expensive live-action film Disney had made in its history to that point. So, the small matter of writing the script. Well, that first script was Robert Ray Poole and Jonathan Hensleigh. And then with the film being produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, Jerry Bruckheimer's process was bringing an assortment of writers to do rewrites and rewrites and rewrites and rewrites. That's what happened. I'll come back to that shortly. But separately, Bruce Willis, well, he'd had a hit with Die Hard with a Vengeance, which had Die Hard with a Vengeance and Pulp Fiction had resurrected his career again. And so he was now making a smaller film called Broadway Brawler that Disney was backing, but ultimately he wanted out of that film. He wasn't happy at all. Shooting was underway, and in terms of legalities, Disney had him pretty much over a contractual barrel with this one that Willis had signed. He'd taken the salary, and so he had to complete the film, otherwise Disney could sue him. And so the usual, yes, we will sue him. But conversely, what Joe Roth saw was an opportunity to lock down a movie star for a number of films. And so instead of suing Bruce Willis for the money for starring in Broadway Brawler and basically the collapse of that film, I've written about that on the Film Stories website if you want to search that out, he brokered a deal with the star where Willis would make 3 films for the studio. And it's really interesting that Willis was cornered basically into making 3 movies. One of them was The Sixth Sense, one of them was The Kid, one of them was Armageddon, and that would basically be 3 of the biggest hits that he had in that era. Even The Kid isn't talked about an awful lot, but that was a big profitable film. Up until that point, Armageddon hadn't really been a movie star film either. There was a report that Disney had considered Arnold Schwarzenegger as a possible to take on the role of Harry Stamper in the film. Harry Stamper, of course, leads a team of drillers onto an asteroid to drill into the asteroid, to put a bomb in the asteroid, to blow it up, to save the world, and everyone's going to be all right. But at first, even though Disney was going to spend big on it, this was going to be a star vehicle, but Roth wanted the insurance of having a big movie star, and he had the opportunity to economically bring a movie star to the project. The story goes that Bruce Willis was paid about $9 million effectively for starring in Armageddon and giving it that star wattage, but also crucially for Disney, because Willis was negotiating from a position of weakness on this, he couldn't ask for percentage points of the box office gross either. And given that he was the only high-profile movie star in it, Disney was going to be able to keep the vast majority of the profit points on this. Contrast that with something like a more modern Spielberg film, where Spielberg takes a much reduced salary but can take anywhere up to 17.5% of the box office gross in return, that he shares the gamble with it, but then he shares a significant upside. Or look at the deal that Sandra Bullock brokered for Gravity that made her nearly 9 figures. Disney didn't have to necessarily worry about this. It was going to be a hugely expensive film, but at least when the box office came in, it was only Jerry Bruckheimer who would have points on it. Elsewhere, the cast, well, I mean, it's a big ensemble, and Steve Buscemi and Billy Bob Thornton both basically admitted that they did this one for the money, and they have a lot of fun with it, but they knew what they were getting into. I mean, Steve Buscemi had appeared in Jerry Bruckheimer production for Disney, Con Air, which I've covered before, and is clearly a glorious masterpiece of a film. It was Buscemi, meanwhile, that would be pivotal in the development of his character Rockhound, and in particular that Rockhound sees the whole thing as a suicide mission in the film, and has the kind of wry, downbeat sense of humour right through it. Liv Tyler, meanwhile, well, she was offered the role of Grace Stamper, Harry's daughter, in the film. Apparently Mila Jovovich and Robin Wright had already turned it down, but then Liv Tyler had turned that film down as well. She turned it down a couple of times before she ultimately signed up to play the part. For Michael Clarke Duncan, the late great Michael Clarke Duncan, this film would be a stepping stone to the Green Mile for him, that Bruce Willis would recommend him to director Frank Darabont for the Green Mile off the back of his work in Armageddon. Well, he was discovered in a gym by director Michael Bay, and he was persuaded to audition. And in a really lovely piece written in the Hollywood Reporter after we tragically lost Michael Clarke Duncan early, Bay would say his first day on Armageddon, he sucked. I remember looking to Ben Affleck and thinking we might need to fire him, but I told him, Mike, I hired you for you. I want the sweet Mr. Clarke Duncan I met in that room, and I said the audience is going to fall in love with you, which they pretty much did in this film. Ben Affleck, meanwhile, he came to the project, I mean, in much the same way that Matt Damon signed up for Saving Private Ryan at a point where his fame was virtually non-existent. Well, that was the same with Ben Affleck, that the pair would hit big with Good Will Hunting and Oscar success not long afterwards. But at the point Ben Affleck was hired for Armageddon, he was not a big name. And when he booked the role of AJ in the film, Michael Bay reportedly sent him off for dental work and a heavy workout regime as well, all part and parcel of getting him into the role. But such was Affleck's position, really, in the food chain at that point. He couldn't really argue. One of the reasons, well, the key reason really, though, why all this was moving fast, because this casting came together very quickly as well, was there wasn't just one competing project going up against Armageddon, as Joe Roth would title the film. It's he that came up with the name for it. There were two, because there was a third asteroid about to hit planet Earth film, which had James Cameron's name on it. And that was a film called Bright Angel Falling that Cameron had penned a treatment for, and at one stage Peter Hyams was going to direct the film and Gale Ann Hurd would produce it. Gale Ann Hurd would be an executive producer in the end on Armageddon. And this was the story of a divorced astronaut called Will Secord, who has a 15-year-old daughter who's rebelling. I mean, slightly familiar ingredients here. And it's basically the challenge of Bright Angel Falling would have been, how do you stop this comet hitting the Earth? And they discover an old student thesis which has an idea to place 2 bombs on the comet. These bombs alter the trajectory. It will miss Earth. We'll all survive. The problem with Bright Angel Falling, though, is it got off the blocks too slowly. And to a degree, at first, the fear was Armageddon had got off the blocks too slowly as well. That Deep Impact was up and running quicker. Deep Impact was also a more economical film to make than Armageddon, but nonetheless this was very much a race and a half to get these films together. This was a point where blockbuster films had a habit of clashing. Dante's Peak and Volcano came out fairly close together as well, but this was going to be one of the biggest battles that Hollywood had known. The race to get to production then meant that there was only 4 months of pre-production that could be done on Armageddon, all the while the script was being reworked. And I'll come back to the writers a little bit later when we talk about the arbitration on the movie in terms of who ultimately got the credits. But it was a race to get this shot. Filming would begin on the movie on the 27th of August 1997. And before I get too deep into that, I should talk about the casting of Jason Isaacs in the film, because I had I had the fortune to have a long chat with him about this. And he talked about when it was 2 a.m. when he got a phone call. He was about to shoot the film Divorcing Jack in Ireland. He got a phone call and said, Michael Bay wants to offer you a part in Armageddon. And Isaacs said, that's brilliant. Who's Michael Bay and what's Armageddon? And basically what had happened is 6 months earlier, Isaacs had done a tour of Hollywood to get his name out there, to talk to lots of studio people and to get on their radars. And he'd read the script for Armageddon there. He'd had to read it. He'd had to read it behind locked doors at Disney. They weren't getting it out. And he said, they put me in this office, a room with glass front, while someone was watching me. An assistant came and gave it to me. It's printed on dark paper, and they said, "You've got an hour." So fast forward 6 months, they told him that he got the job and he was still on. They said, "Right, you've got to be there on Tuesday," and he couldn't be there on Tuesday because he was on set in 5 hours' time shooting his new film, and he refused to back out of that. They tried to tell him it was a Bruce Willis project, but he basically said, "I'm committed to it." But Michael Bay instead offered him the role of Professor Quincy in the film, which was a smaller role than he was originally being offered. It would be 8 days shooting over 5 months. And as Isaac said, he felt like he got the dusty bin role, but it was better than nothing. And so he describes the first day of his shooting was a scene where he got some lines. Michael Bay's 100 yards away in front of a bank of monitors. He had a chat with him. Then he went to do the scene. And then he did the scene in a different accent. His character had a different accent to the way he talked normally, and Michael Bay just booms across the set to him, "Hey, what's that? Is that theatre training? Is that what they teach you in theatre school?" And so Isaacs was just like really scared, went over to Bay. It turned out Michael Bay was delighted. And basically, from that point on, he wanted Jason Isaacs to have a bigger role in the film. And he says, and that's why Isaacs is standing around for so much of it. He says, "I'm sitting there with Billy Bob Thornton for the entire film with all to do. The only thing I did was the smartest man on the planet, and so, which is how he was described. And he held a papier-mâché asteroid, and etc., etc., etc. And whilst he would never say which other part he was offered on the film, he would say the experience of it was an awful lot of waiting around. But then it was pretty breakneck, though. The production began, and Bruce Willis wasn't there right at the start. He would join the ensemble later. And instead, one of the earliest scenes of Armageddon to be shot was a moment, I'm going very spoiler-like, it was a moment at the crash site of the Independence where Ben Affleck and Michael Clark Duncan were amongst those who were basically being used as guinea pigs as to how well the spacesuits looked on film. As Bruce Willis had expressed a few issues with them, and they'd been a bone of contention in pre-production as well. That Bay says on the director's commentary on the disc that after a lot of development, 3 weeks before he saw them hung up, and he said they looked like Adidas jogging suits. And so a lot of last-minute changes needed to be made to them. The first day was technically quite challenging. Not an awful lot was working, but nonetheless, it just about hung together, and those were the suits we ended up seeing. It was an extensive, even though there's a lot of visual effects work in the film, it was also an extensive, very big physical production as well. The main drill site set in the film was a whole soundstage at Disney. They picked one of the biggest sound stages in all of Hollywood, and even then they had to make it bigger because they had to take the floor of it down by, I think it's a further 40 feet goes the story. So just so the height of the set was big enough. And that alone cost $1 million or $2 just to get it right. They also filled the set pretty much wall to wall and absolutely packed it just with this one set of the surface of the comet. That said, a lot of the expensive stuff you see in the film, well, that belonged to NASA. Actually, there's billions of dollars worth of NASA technology in the film. And this is where producer Jerry Bruckheimer's work on Top Gun had come in particularly useful, because Top Gun had been seen as a particularly non-contentious by the American military. They'd given full access to military vehicles, etc. And it had served as a very, very strong recruitment tool. In the case of NASA, it too just didn't see there was anything really critical of NASA here, and so gave permission to shoot in its premises, including the hugely restricted weightlessness pool. I'll have 2 runs at that you see in the film. The actors, a couple of the actors were able to use suits worth millions of dollars. They were able to shoot around the launch pads at NASA as well. Although, as a beautiful little coda to that, Bay went into this film knowing the inaccuracies. He knew that it was playing, hostage with science, really. Great big explosions in space for a start. But what he knew also was he wanted this to be a big, entertaining film. And there's a story of Roland Emmerich, for instance, when he was making The Day After Tomorrow, tomorrow, swatting up on climate change, on weather, on changes in the planet, and then learning the science, then working out which bits he needed to tell the story, and then running roughshod over the rest in the pursuit of entertainment. And that's what Bay was doing too. So the coda to NASA giving permission is apparently NASA now uses the film Armageddon in its training and asks people to point out the errors as part of its training course. Apparently there's over about 150 of them. Bruce Willis would join the shoot fairly soon after filming began. His first day actually was right at the end of the film. It was a message he sends back at the end of the movie. See how spoiler light that was? And Willis was really insistent on the ending of the film that we actually get, that it doesn't quite go entirely the direction you might think it does. And that's because Willis dug his feet in and said, I mean, the story goes that he said that this is the condition of making it, but given the legal position he was in at the time, quite how much force that had, it is unknown really. Nonetheless, the production carried on. I mean, that DVD commentary again is just gold dust. It's one of the best DVD commentaries of a contemporary film so soon after its release, because that's where you get Ben Affleck in very dry mode talking about how the discussion about how he was asking questions throughout the film's production. Michael, isn't it easier to teach astronauts to drill rather than turn drillers into astronauts? He kept coming up with these questions during the show, and they are not unreasonable questions, to be fair. Michael Bay apparently had an answer for him, but as this is a very family-friendly podcast, I won't necessarily pass that answer on to you. Little bits and bobs from around the shoot. There's a moment in the film where there's a dog that destroys Godzilla dolls. This dog was specially trained to do it, and obviously it's a great big dig at Roland Emmerich's Godzilla movie, which was expected to be the huge film of that summer. Apparently the dog cost $20,000 a day to have on set, and they basically, as the story goes, had to hold cardboard boxes up to hide the Godzilla dolls to stop the dog from destroying them until the moment where the camera was switched on. There was a lot of room in the midst of it for improvisation as well, and not just because the screenplay of Armageddon was quite so fluid. So there's a really funny sequence. I'm a huge fan of Armageddon, but there's a really funny sequence where the drillers are making their demands. What would they want in exchange for going off and saving the world? And Bruce Willis is reading these demands off a piece of paper. As it turns out, it's pretty much ad-libbed. That the actors were asked to write down what they'd want, and Bruce Willis reads what they put on those pieces of paper, and they played the scene out like that. But Bay was also, he'd come off Making Bad Boys. He'd learned lessons from Making Bad Boys about working with improvisational comedians. And so in particular for the training sequences in Armageddon, what they did was they set up the outline of what the actors needed to do, but then gave them an awful lot of space just to play around with that. So the ensemble in there were told roughly what beats they've got to hit, but then the cameras rolled and they just pulled together the sequence that we ultimately see in the movie. Now, Armageddon was reacting also, it's worth noting, to other things that were going on, but in 1997, of course, Titanic went bananas. James Cameron's film Titanic would become the biggest film ever at the box office and would go on to win an awful lot of Oscars. Disney, meanwhile, remained nervous about Armageddon, that it's spending so much money on a film that also had a direct rival coming out in advance. It was clear by this point, by the end of 1997, that Deep Impact was going to win the race to cinemas. Thus, one of the things it took from Titanic was there was a romance in there. There was the romance between Jack and Rose, played by Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. And while I'd argue that Titanic had a bigger influence on Michael Bay's next project, Pearl Harbor, it had an influence here as well, that Scott Rosenberg came in during filming to beef up the romance between the characters of AJ and Grace in the movie. And that was said to be in part a response to the success of Titanic, but also the whole idea of giving us all just one or two more hooks into it and giving us a few more things to root for. there were moments that were shot in more than one way. I played you a clip just before from where they're singing Leaving on a Jet Plane. That was shot two ways, for instance. That's when the astronauts, well, the drillers, it's hard to call them astronauts really, but the drillers are about to go into space, and they filmed a standard version of it that with people just saying goodbye to each other, and then they shot the version where Affleck starts singing, and it was Scott Rosenberg who ultimately told Michael Bay that this was the scene, this was the key moment to try and get the audience on side, and apparently it was his idea to have Affleck sing to her. Bruce Willis was there, he quite liked the scene, but then he was also pretty sure that it was going to be cut, not least because they were all singing in very different keys and it was a bit all over the shop, and it took a lot of work really to sort all of that out. Of course, that sequence made it into the movie, and even more prominently it made it onto a little independent podcast like all these years later. Who knew? In all, this was a very, very heavy production in that it shot for, I think it was over 120 days or something like that. In fact, filming wrapped up in January 1998, and the premiere was due at the end of June of that year. And all the while, there was the pressure of deep impact. And this really affected to a degree how Disney approached the post-production and the publicity of the movie. But in all, Bay had about 16 weeks to cement his final cut, and that meant bringing in some 250 effect shots that were ultimately all used in the film, far more than he'd ever worked with before. Bay consulted James Cameron for advice on just how to manage all of that, really. But also, it's worth noting too, there was a lot of footage to sort through. There was over 1 million feet of film shot. So I went off and tried to work out exactly how much that equates to, and by my math, that's over 180 hours of material was shot for Armageddon. The final running time comes in at 2.5 hours. Now, appreciating sequences were shot from multiple angles and all the improvisation and bits and bobs. And as the Starlog article points out, the 3,000 scenes set up. I did go back and check that as well. I think I read somewhere the average shot length in Armageddon is 1.5 seconds or something like that. So it does sort of make sense. 100 cars blown up in the movie. All of this had to be wrangled into a cut. All the while just taking a few shots at deep impact, which Bay did in a couple of interviews. And then there was how Disney goes about promoting the film as well. So going back to the point about how it used to be a frugal studio, Joe Roth was banking on blockbuster hits and was paying to get them. He'd seen a whole series of films that had underperformed, such as Mr. Magoo and Kundun from Martin Scorsese. That Summer's The Horse Whisperer and 6 Days, 7 Nights wouldn't set the box office alight or do just about decent money. And according to the LA Times, this was the one. This was the film that it was banking everything on, the one that, as I discussed just before, that had the path to profit. Roth was throwing everything behind it. He said this movie involves our whole company, and that they were approaching it in the same way they really did a Disney branded family film as opposed to a live action movie. They were spending $150 million on the promotion. They had tie-ins from McDonald's, from Mattel. They spent $40 million on television advertising. The McDonald's tie-in went for 6 weeks, which was about as much as it had done for any animated film. They also took the film to the Cannes Film Festival in the spring of that year to try and steal a bit of Deep Impact's thunder. They screened 50 minutes of the movie, and when journalists snickered at that, Willis countered that he was glad that they found the end of the world so funny, so they wrote that up as well, and that all just added to this great big huge battle that was taking place. It was only in post-production too that the Aerosmith song, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, was added. And again, this was a reaction to other market forces, that they learned that the movie of Godzilla was having an album released alongside it. And so this stirred Jerry Bruckheimer into action, and they'd already got the song on hand to potentially use in the film. They approached Aerosmith. Aerosmith came in and watched some footage, agreed, and within a few days had recorded and laid down the track that ultimately you hear in the movie. Meanwhile, Michael Bay was invited to a screening of Deep Impact as well, that Paramount allowed him to come along and see the film. And after the screening, he said that Deep Impact was a different film to Armageddon. He was sure that Armageddon would find a mass audience, but also there were still changes that were being made in this post-production period, that it was this 16 weeks was just getting to the point of insanity. So the sequence where Paris is destroyed in the movie was added late in production, after a test screening had taken place, that Joe Roth authorised the spending of millions more dollars to add a few more explosions and boom and bang and bayhem, really goes to cliche. And it was a sequence that had originally been in the script, but had been dropped out because of budget reasons. But it was Roth really who just pulled the trigger and just figured, if we're going for this, we're going for this. Also, there's some Super 8 footage that you see at the end of the film. That was a late addition as well. As in fact, it was shot by a future Oscar-winning director by the name of Ben Affleck. It was on his Super 8 camera that was ultimately put together. The film also, there's a lovely publicity story. I found this in Total Film magazine, where Disney paid to have a drape down the side of a Los Angeles skyscraper, and it was basically an image of the same building as if an asteroid had just gone straight through it, and they had to take that down in the end because it looked too realistic and was panicking people as well. Now, I've talked a little bit about the writing on this as well, but just to give you an idea of how many people worked on this and how many people were going for the lucrative credit, the writing credit on the film. And it was the Los Angeles Times that unpickled it and reported the Writers Guild of America arbitration that said the writing credits should list the rare combination of screenplay by Jonathan Hensleigh and J.J. Abrams. The adaptation by is a very, very, very rare credit, and goes to the fact that Tony Gilroy and Shane Salerno came in and adapted parts of basically the original story. And then there was as is generally the thing with the Writers Guild of America, the people who originated the original screenplay, Robert Ray Poole and Jonathan Hensleigh, they get story credit as well. But also involved in the arbitration were the likes of Paul Atanasio, Ann Biderman, Scott Rosenberg, Robert Town. They all contributed to the film. Somehow, the movie made it to cinemas on time after Deep Impact had hit big. I mean, that had already proven to be both critically successful, but also had given DreamWorks SKG, the studio that released, its first big blockbuster hit. So the pressure was on Armageddon, really. The reviews weren't kind for the movie, but as Edmund Blackadder always said, you can't argue with the box office. It opened to $36 million. Its opening weekend in the US, and it would knock Dr. Dolittle off the top of the chart. Also around at that time was Mulan, Out of Sight, The X-Files, The Truman Show, Perfect Murder still in there. And it was a huge hit. In fact, it was the biggest live-action hit that Disney had at that point in its history. Armageddon would go on to make, its full box office total was $200 million in the US, $352 million overseas, for $553 million worldwide. That and the estimate had been beforehand that Disney needed it to get to about $300 million before it saw profit. This was a big, booming, loud, crashing blockbuster film that proved to be a hugely profitable one. Wasn't one that the studio could franchise. It's one that lots of people throw brickbats at. I really like Armageddon though, and there's never a day that goes by where I don't request permission to shake the hand of the daughter of the bravest man I've ever met. Which brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. I'm running a Kickstarter at the moment for Film Stories magazine and Film Stories Junior magazine, independent film magazines with opportunity at their heart as well. We write about so many films that you may not get to hear about elsewhere, and we just find all these wonderful stories. I'd love to keep these magazines going. You can find more on that at the Film Stories website, filmstories.co.uk. I am a fully independent publisher. It is me in a room. There's no glamour to this. If you can help, if you can help spread the word of this podcast, as lots of you have done, please subscribe. That helps me enormously. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that helps me enormously too. I'm waffling well over my normal time limit though, so I'm going to go straight into the second of the two films I'm talking about this in this episode. Let's go back to 1990. I'll play you a clip with one little bit of foul language in it.
Slum kids. I was a slum kid. Everybody talks like that.
They do not. What do you think I say when I go to the feed store in town? Oh, now, Wally, give me a bag of that effing pig feed and 10 pounds that bitchly cow corn. And in the bank, do I tell Mrs. Bollinger, oh, here's one big bastard of a check. Give me some of your Christing money. There, look there. See what you made me do. Oh, Paul, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, there's a list of movie characters I don't think I particularly like to mess with, and one of them is Annie Wilkes, played by Kathy Bates in 1990's Misery. Also, James Caan as Paul Sheldon, Richard Farnsworth, in Lauren Bacall in the ensemble as well. It's a fairly tight ensemble too. Written by, the screenplay written by William Goldman, based on the novel by Stephen King. The film directed by Rob Reiner. Now, the story of Misery, I mean, inevitably, it starts with Stephen King. That King wrote the source novel, which was published in 1987. It featured the character of Annie Wilkes nursing her favourite author Paul Sheldon back to full health after she discovers him following a car accident. And I mean, it came out a long time afterwards that King wrote the book with he's effectively the author, and Annie a metaphor for the drug problem that kept following him around and would never leave him be at that point. Separately, Rob Reiner, I mean, his directorial career was really building up in the 1980s. So we've gone through This is Spinal Tap, and then he would also do When Harry Met Sally. But it was 1986's Stand By Me that was pivotal here, in that was based on a Stephen King story. That lots of Stephen King stories have been adapted for the screen. It's just Stephen King hadn't particularly liked all of them. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining was regarded as one of the most successful. It's well known that King just couldn't stand it. In the case of Stand By Me, he really could. Now, Rob Reiner's producer, one of his regular producers at the time, is a man called Andy Scheinman, and it was Scheinman who read the book first, and he hugely impressed with it, and he got in touch with King with the idea of adapting the book for the screen, but King wasn't going to sell this one. He's been very protective of it. He'd been dissatisfied with how Hollywood had treated his work, and so it was a no. However, there was that previous treatment of the film that became Stand By Me. And so Rob Reiner and Stephen King had a conversation, and King, in the end, I mean, Rob Reiner at this point had set up his production company, Castle Rock, so he had some independence from the Hollywood system, and When Harry Met Sally was being made through that company. But King said, yeah, he'd sell it to Rob Reiner for a lot of money, fair enough, but on the condition that Reiner directed or produced the movie. Now, Reiner had no intention of directing the film, but he said yes, he agreed to the deal, and Misery was pressing ahead. Reiner, of course, had also done The Princess Bride, screenplay for which was written by the legendary late screenwriter William Goldman, and Reiner and Scheinman got in touch with William Goldman with a view to him writing Misery, the screenplay Misery. And Goldman was interested. He'd read the book a couple of times, and he was unsure what he was going to take the project on the first time he was going through it, until he got what's best described in the book as the hobbling scene, and he was completely taken aback by it. He didn't see the scene coming, and it just haunted him and stayed in his head afterwards. And he talks about this in the book Four Screenplays, where not only does he generously print the full screenplay of Misery, but also does a full essay on the making and the production of the film. And inevitably I've drawn on that quite a bit for the story that I'm telling you now, but I do hugely recommend seeking out Goldman's writing. He's also written about the film in the book What Lie Did I Tell, which is also hugely recommended. Now, it was that single scene, and that's what caused. That's what led to Goldman saying, "Yeah, I'm going to do this one." And so, I mean, in What Lie Did I Tell, he talks about how he adapts a book, and he goes through with a marker pen, with a highlighter pen, and highlights the key passages. He read it a few times, and the process of adapting the book to the screenplay took around 6 months. He worked closely with Scheinman and Reiner while doing it, and while they were doing that, they went off to look for a director for the film. The top choice was legendary director George Roy Hill. If you're not familiar with the name, you're more than likely very familiar with a couple of the films he did. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, these were films that he directed. And he was interested in Misery. He was in, I want to do this. And then he was out. And this is going to be a common recurrence. What caused him to do a U-turn on the film was the hobbling scene in the movie, and he thought about it, had sleepless nights. He just decided he just couldn't direct it. He couldn't make that scene happen. And as much as Reiner and Simon tried to persuade him otherwise, George Roy Hill backed out of directing the movie. So at that point, Castle Rock was looking at other options. So Barry Levinson's name, that came up. He'd had success with Good Morning Vietnam and Rain Man, of course. And he was seriously considered, but he never got to a stage where an offer went out to Levinson because Rob Reiner had basically his sod it moment, and he said he was going to direct it himself. Now, this was a leap and a half for Reiner. I think it's known now that Reiner's career has taken him across all sorts of genre, but this was the biggest leap he'd done, because generally known for much lighter films to this point. And here was a jump into a horror thriller. I mean, this was Hitchcock territory, and it's no secret that Reiner watched a lot of Hitchcock films to get into the head of how to make a film like this. There was still ongoing uncertainty over the hobbling that was in the book that had made it to the screenplay, to the point where staff at Castle Rock, as Goldman wrote, were polled as to their views on it. There was so much unease about it. But while all that was going on, there was the matter of casting. Now, I've just talked about Armageddon and how I had 4 months of pre-production to make a huge physical production. In the case of Misery, it took 6 months to cast it. And this is a film that does not have a long cast list at all. The call sheet for the film is quite brief. There aren't that many speaking parts in it. Now, I mean, the role of Annie Wilkes, the ethos they were going for is the person who took on the role of Annie Wilkes should be relatively unknown to film audiences. The person who took on the role of Paul Sheldon should be very known. And that was the contrast that they were really going for. And so Goldman, I mean, admitted when he was writing the adaptation, he'd seen Kathy Bates on Broadway. He thought she was a major theatre talent. I mean, she was earning rave reviews for Frankie and Johnny at the Claire de Lune, which was ultimately brought to the movies by Pretty Woman director Gary Marshall, with Michelle Pfeiffer contentiously in the Kathy Bates role of the film. But Goldman was a huge fan of Kathy Bates, but that didn't mean other people weren't sounded out for the role of Annie Wilkes. It's well known that Bette Midler was up there on the list, and I've written before about Bette Midler's extraordinary box office run in the 80s and 90s, you know, the Outrageous Fortunes, the Big Business. She was one of two comedy actors who got almost an old-fashioned studio deal. She got a 4 or 5 picture commitment off Disney. Eddie Murphy was the other in the 80s with Paramount. Such was the reliability of her at the box office. It always staggers me she's not celebrated more as the box office juggernaut, really, she was at that point. But she was concerned over Misery, and she was concerned as to the violent nature of the role. And as she would tell the New York Times back in 2013, I turned that down because I didn't want to saw off someone's foot. And even though the role would ultimately win an Oscar, which it did for Kathy Bates, I don't think that's spoiling anything either. And Midler said, Midler would ultimately say it was stupid to say no to those pictures, because around the same time she turned down Sister Act as well. Now, Angelica Houston was apparently one of those on the radar for Misery to take on the role of Annie Wilkes, but she was committed to make The Grifters. That's a terrific film, that is. And so she couldn't do it. And in the end, they went for Kathy Bates. And this was where the Castle Rock card was useful, because if Misery had been made as a studio film, there's pretty much no way they'd have been able to cast Kathy Bates in that role. But Castle Rock was an independent production company, and thus had the clout to be able to cast someone who wasn't necessarily box office gold. No disrespect to Kathy Bates, who I think is an extraordinary actor. But then came the problem, because for the role of Paul Sheldon, and Goldman explains this in his book, it had to be a less flashy role but needed the bigger star power in it. And it was that rarest of things in Hollywood of a male lead under the control of a woman for the duration of the film, and that did not have leading stars queuing up to take on the role. So, I mean, Goldman goes through the exhaustive list of people who turned it down. So let's go through them. William Hurt, who was believed to be the first to be approached to play Paul Sheldon, he said no. Then they rewrote the script to try and tempt him again, and he said no. Kevin Kline turned it down. Michael Douglas, they got as far as him having a meeting with director Rob Reiner, then he said no. Harrison Ford said no. Dustin Hoffman, well, he liked the ethos of Castle Rock. He went and had a chat with Rob Reiner and said no. Reiner, though, was still digging in. All these refusals were coming in and was still digging in because he knew he needed a name actor to play the role. He knew that the idea was Annie wasn't famous and Paul was. Jack Nicholson said no. Robert De Niro said no. Richard Dreyfuss said yes. Brilliant. Old high school friend of Rob Reiner. He turned down When Harry Met Sally, so felt a bit bad about that. So yeah, I'll do it. Send me the script. They sent him the script. He said no. Gene Hackman, he said no. Robert Redford read it. He took a meeting. He said no. Warren Beatty then got interested. I mean, he was knee-deep in Dick Tracy at the time, which came out in 1990 also. But Beatty's point, though, was this. He had no trouble losing his feet at the ankles, but know that if you did it, the guy would be crippled for life and would be a loser. That was the objection, I'm quoting there. That was the objection that was cited by Warren Beatty for not taking the role. He said no. Eventually, the name of James Caan was floated. Now, Caan was, a hugely talented actor. I mean, he's working The Godfather, for instance. I mean, it needs no introduction. But it's no secret also that at this point, he'd been known to be battling addiction, had his demons, really. And so, I mean, they were interested in him, and Caan came and took a meeting, and he assured Rob Reiner that he was clean. And so, ultimately, after many people had turned this one down, James Caan agreed and signed on the dotted line, not really fully appreciating what he was about to walk into. Now, while the casting was going on, they tightened the script as well. Simon and Reiner were working on the script and just tightening it up. And unbeknownst to William Goldman, the hobbling scene was cut out of the script and replaced instead with the moment that we get in the film. And William Goldman was not impressed. It was the scene that had sold him on the project, that had made him want to adapt this to write the screenplay. And he was fuming about it, and he pushed back against Rob Reiner, and Rob Reiner didn't budge. I mean, Rob Reiner is regarded as a very, very intelligent and tough collaborator, not in a bad way. It's well known that when he was making A Few Good Men with Aaron Sorkin, that was Sorkin's debut screenplay, the pushing backwards and forth was fierce, all to the good of the piece as well. And so it didn't matter that Goldman was this Oscar-winning screenwriter. Reiner was not budging. The change was done, and Goldman, to his credit, he would ultimately admit that he got it wrong and Reiner was right. That what he didn't appreciate and Reiner did was this had to be a horrific moment in the film, but it only had to be horrific enough. It just had to be at a level to get the audience reaction and no more beyond that. Hence the substitution that was made. The film went off into production then on the 20th of February 1990. It was shot in Nevada and shot also in studio in California. And it was an intense shoot. I mean, to a large degree, there's an element of stage play about it. Bates, for one, was used to theatre as well and rehearsal, and Caan was more used to film and going on his instincts. So the pair, there were sparks between the pair over that, although they were reported to ultimately support each other. Bates, too, was said to have really struggled with the days when she had to shoot the violent sequences. They were completely out of her comfort zone, and she really needed some psyching up for that and found them quite upsetting to do. For the sequence, how's that for spoiler free for those of you who haven't seen Misery? Caan required some fake legs basically to be made out of gelatine that also had armatures inside, so they would have some degree of flexibility. This was not a CG film, and so there's a particularly haunting moment in Misery that had to be shot, and it was a complex shot to get, certainly a complex shot to get in camera. And I did this with the video once. Remember those kids? I did freeze frame and just did it a frame forward at a time, and the particular moment, they do it. I won't say more for the purposes of spoiler, but they put a physical effect in there and they absolutely do it. Now, most of the film is set in a house. This much is pretty much known. And those moments were also shot pretty much in sequence, as I understand it. This was something that Reiner wanted to do, and it built the tension of the shoot. It also meant that James Caan was pretty much in bed for 3.5 months of shooting. The first moment where his character is able to get out of the bed was almost like a breathe out point for the cast and crew, because for the first time they were able to get out of this bedroom where they'd been shooting the film for so long. There was a story as well that Caan arrived one day and he arrived hungover, and it led to a day of, let's just say, not very good scenes that couldn't be used. And Reiner, I mean, this goes to lots of people have very fond stories of working on a Rob Reiner set, and he covered it by saying it was a problem with the lab. And Caan reported he didn't find this out for quite a while. Throughout, Reiner was, again, invoking Hitchcock and leaning on Hitchcock influences and wondering what would Hitchcock do. There was one more complex physical scene, where the car accident that's the catalyst for the film, really. And that was the bit where they had to bring in multiple cameras. That they knew they were going to have to throw a car off a cliff. They knew they could realistically only do it once. And so they had to shoot it from lots and lots of different angles, and they had multiple setups in order to capture that. But the film would ultimately wrap shooting at the end of May in 1990. There's just over 3 months of this. And if you think of the film and where it goes and ultimately where it doesn't go, that's a lot of time to spend in one location on something like this. The film ultimately then had cost Castle Rock around $20 million to make. So, I mean, fairly modest, really, but also this was a film made by an independent company, and it opened to really strong reviews. It also opened 2 weeks after Home Alone, and so its debut in the US was the weekend of November the 30th to December the 2nd, and it landed second at the box office with a $10 million opening weekend, at a point where $10 million opening weekend was a real success. Less requirement really to make all your money within a week or two. Home Alone was number one. Again, to give you a flavour of what else was around, Three Men and a Little Lady, that was in third. Dances with Wolves at 4. Predator 2 at 5. Also in the mix there were Rocky 5 was still around at that point. The Rescuers Down Under. Ghost was still about, after 21 weeks in the top 10. Ghost was still around. But Misery was a hit. It was, we didn't get it until May of 1991 in the UK. In fact, we got it after The Silence of the Lambs in the UK. But a lot of the praise was centred on the two lead performances, James Caan and particularly Kathy Bates. And chief amongst the champions of the film was Stephen King, who was hugely satisfied with the adaptation of the movie. Box office wise, well, the film was in profit. I mean, it was a profitable hit that would take $60 million worldwide, and also would be a hit on video and subsequently DVD. And it got a 25th anniversary disc release as well. Such is the reputation and the strength of the movie. Then there were the awards, and whilst the film itself was pretty much overlooked, Kathy Bates wasn't. She picked up the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Motion Picture Drama. She won a few of the Critics Awards as well, but crucially, she found herself up for Best Actress at the Academy Awards and the 63rd Academy Awards, which took place in March of 1991, and she won Oscar Gold. She would beat Angelica Houston, ironically, for her role in The Grifters. She was also up against Julia Roberts, Meryl Streep and Joanne Woodward, and she would take home an Oscar for her performance, and really deservedly so. The aftermath, well, Stephen King would go on to write Dolores Claiborne with Kathy Bates in mind, and she would indeed star in the film version of that as well. But then also Misery became a Broadway play as well in 2015. And just to tie the two films, really, we've talked about in this episode together, that would star Bruce Willis at a point where Bruce Willis was getting negative headlines for how much work he was on movie sets. He went and made his Broadway debut in an adaptation of Misery that William Goldman would write, that he starred opposite Laurie Metcalf, and got really respectable reviews for his work in the film as well. However, it's really hard to beat the effective two-hander here of James Caan and of Kathy Bates in the film, and just the intensity that Rob Reiner manages to capture. It's Reiner hasn't done thrillers really since. I mean, he would go off and do A Few Good Men after this one, and that would be another gigantic hit as well. But I'd like to see him have another run at it. But conversely, it's going to be pretty hard to match Misery, isn't it? And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. You can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. We've got YouTube, Film Stories, youtube.com/Film Stories. And then there's our website, www.filmstories.co.uk, where you can find out about our print magazines. You get a day, every weekday, you get a dose of movie news and more Film Stories features as well. And basically, we're throwing everything at you in the hope that you like it and you continue to support us. You have done so far. I can't thank you enough for that. For now, the most important thing is you all take care of yourselves, you stay safe, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Bye bye.